6 decades after his presidency, John F. Kennedy remains one of the most iconic presidents in United States history. He's generally remembered for his glamorous image, his memorable quotes, and the bold, optimistic vision he had for the nation's future. To some, this has also created the impression that his presidency was more style than substance. Kennedy was president for less than 3 years before his assassination. However, he faced substantial challenges both at home and abroad during his short time in office. When Kennedy took office in 1961, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had been ongoing for over a decade. Because a direct confrontation could end in nuclear war, the two superpowers battled indirectly, engaging in numerous proxy wars, competing economically, and gaining the allegiance of smaller nations. As Kennedy was the nation's youngest elected president, many doubted his ability to guide it through such an important time. Even if he could safely avert nuclear destruction, his supposed inexperience and weakness might lead to the Soviets gaining too much of an edge in the conflict, and early on, Kennedy's performance only fueled these doubts. His first failure was in Cuba. The Cuban government was overthrown by communist revolutionaries 2 years before Kennedy took office, and the United States faced the threat of a Soviet-aligned nation sitting only 90 miles from its southeast border. Under the Eisenhower administration, a plan had been put together to overthrow the new communist government in Cuba, and Kennedy authorized the plan. The Bay of Pigs invasion started less than 3 months into Kennedy's term and was over within just 3 days with the defeat of the U.S.-aligned rebels. The failure has been attributed to many factors, from Kennedy's alteration to the original plan to his limited support for the anti-communist rebels, and some believed that he should have never authorized the plan to begin with. Different criticisms came from the left and the right. The common factor in many of these criticisms was that Kennedy had acted poorly. There seemed to be more evidence of Kennedy's lack of ability a few months later in June of 1961, when he met with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev at the Vienna summit. Kennedy appeared weak and unprepared, whereas Khrushchev appeared to lead the meeting. Kennedy himself had reportedly described the meeting as, quote, "the worst thing in my life." The optics for the U.S. were no doubt bad, but the ramifications may have went even further. A key topic of the Vienna summit was the status of Germany's capital, Berlin, which had been divided between the Soviets and the U.S. and its allies following World War II. Only 2 months after the summit, Soviet-aligned forces erected the Berlin Wall, which prevented East Germans from migrating west. The weakness Kennedy projected has generally been blamed for this, as Khrushchev was reportedly confident he could have the wall constructed without any U.S. retaliation. In October of 1962, about a year later, Kennedy was informed that the Soviets had deployed ballistic nuclear missiles in Cuba. When launched, they could reach the United States mainland within minutes. Some say Kennedy's perceived weakness had emboldened the Soviets. Others say his involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion provoked the communists in Cuba to seek support from the Soviets, and others say it was for a variety of reasons, some of which weren't Kennedy's fault. Over the next 13 days, the two superpowers were engaged in a standoff. Kennedy held top-secret meetings where he considered options from airstrikes to a full-scale invasion. Eventually, he settled on a naval blockade. 6 days into the crisis, he advised the public of the situation via a televised address. He drew a hard line, warning that the purpose of the Soviet missiles in Cuba could be, quote, none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere, and that he would protect the United States from such a threat no matter the cost. After a tense week of action and reaction from both sides, an agreement was reached in which the Soviets would withdraw their missiles and Kennedy would promise not to invade Cuba. Secretly, Kennedy had also agreed to withdraw U.S. missiles from Italy and Turkey, which had posed a direct threat to the Soviet capital of Moscow. Kennedy earned widespread praise for his handling of an extremely delicate situation which could have rapidly escalated to a nuclear war, while also preserving the United States' strength and integrity. For many, this is seen as Kennedy's finest hour and the moment that redeemed his past failures. Following the crisis, he received a boost in his approval rating, and by some accounts, it was finally at this point that the Soviets took him seriously. Kennedy also increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, another proxy war in the greater conflict, increasing the number of military advisors from 900 to 16,000. Prior to his death, he'd announced plans to reduce this number, but whether this would have meant an overall reduction in U.S. involvement is uncertain, and to this day, people speculate on how differently Kennedy might have handled the war compared to his successor. Even when not engaged in military conflict, Kennedy remained competitive with the Soviet Union. Following the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Soviets putting the first man in space, Kennedy promised that by the end of the decade, America would land the first man on the moon. In June of 1963, he gave a now famous speech in West Germany, showing American solidarity with West Germans following the erection of the Berlin Wall. However, he also took action towards peace, such as signing a treaty with the Soviets which limited the testing of nuclear weapons in space, underwater, and in the Earth's atmosphere. In a 1963 speech, while he maintained his stance on communism as, quote, profoundly repugnant, he said the Russians deserved recognition for their various technological and societal accomplishments. In other international affairs, Kennedy worked to proactively stop the spread of communism in Latin America. He visited various countries, hosted leaders in the White House, and used his Alliance for Progress program to promote economic development and humanitarian efforts. In domestic affairs, while the stakes weren't as high, Kennedy still faced an uphill battle. He proposed numerous liberal initiatives during his presidential campaign, including stimulating the economy, expanding aid to struggling Americans, and expanding access to medical services. However, his optimistic vision clashed with the harsh political realities. At a glance, it might seem as though Kennedy would have had little trouble advancing his agenda. The Democrats had majorities in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. However, the most formidable opposition came from Kennedy's own party. Powerful conservative Democrats controlled key committees and were able to hold up Kennedy's legislation and water it down before it got passed. Upon entering office, Kennedy had made passing a bill for Medicare, federally funded health insurance for the elderly, a top priority. He used the presidency as a bully pulpit to appeal directly to the public, hoping to put pressure on Congress. However, with opposition from Republicans and enough Democrats, it failed to pass. Another top legislative priority was establishing a Department of Urban Affairs and Housing. Kennedy said it was, quote, to improve our patterns of community development and to provide for housing needs of all segments of our population. He also said, quote, urban and suburban areas now contain the overwhelming majority of our population and a preponderance of our industrial, commercial, and educational resources. This bill also failed to pass. One of the reasons was that Southern Democrats feared the first department head would be an African American. In general, Kennedy made minimal legislative progress on civil rights for African Americans, largely because he was concerned about alienating Southern Democrats and losing support for the rest of his agenda. He nonetheless continued federal enforcement of existing civil rights laws. This included deployment of federal troops to ensure black students weren't prevented from attending schools and to defend protesters who were coming into increasingly violent and frequent clashes with white Southerners. It's believed that Kennedy's plan was to focus on new civil rights legislation during his second term, so he wouldn't split his support base prematurely. However, rising public unrest, highly publicized conflicts, and the activism of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. put pressure on Kennedy to act sooner. In 1963, he defined the fight for civil rights as a, quote, moral crisis, and urged Congress to pass a new bill. However, he wouldn't live to see one get passed. Kennedy would see some domestic successes in his lifetime. During his presidential campaign, he'd met with state governors from the Appalachia region who'd been seeking federal aid. Due to mechanization and layoffs, many miners suffered economic hardships, most notably having their medical benefits threatened. He tasked a commission with developing a broad plan to boost the economy of the Appalachian region. Other various successes include an increase in the minimum wage, an amendment to the Social Security Act to aid families with crippled and mentally challenged children, and various benefits for unemployed workers. The economy saw some improvement under Kennedy. When he took office, the nation was in a recession, and by the end of his presidency, unemployment had dropped moderately. Kennedy loosened monetary policy and fully adopted a Keynesian economic program, one that focused on temporarily increasing deficit spending to boost the economy. With the partial nuclear test ban in place by August 1963, Kennedy planned to use the rest of his term to focus on the economy along with other domestic issues. However, he was assassinated in November without seeing much of it come to pass. Other miscellaneous accomplishments included abolishing mandatory death sentences for first-degree murder in Washington, D.C., appointing 2 Supreme Court justices, and establishing the Peace Corps, which trained and deployed volunteers all over the world, especially to aid developing nations. Kennedy is well known for his distinctive style among other presidents, and this isn't incidental. It was part of his political strategy. He deliberately crafted an image to appear more personable through interviews and photo shoots with his family. This helped him stand out, especially to younger voters, many of whom only had memories of presidents who were over 60 years old. With his youthful, attractive family, stylish haircut and well-tailored suits, and his natural charisma, he brought a sense of glamour to the presidency that hadn't been seen in a long time, and even crossed over into celebrity culture. He hosted writers, painters, poets, and musicians in the White House. The White House itself received a makeover from First Lady Jackie Kennedy to give it a more stylish and contemporary appearance. Kennedy also utilized television in a way previous presidents hadn't. Most notably, he capitalized on his telegenic appearance for the presidential debates. He also gave Americans a close-up look at the White House through Jackie's televised tour. And he was the first president to conduct live televised press conferences. These conferences, however, weren't all glamour, as he exposed himself to questions from the press even during uncomfortable situations, such as having to explain his failure in the Bay of Pigs. It did, nonetheless, allow him to appear more personable and transparent to the American people. It's perhaps because of these efforts that he maintained a high approval rating through much of his presidency. Kennedy's critics argue that his well-crafted image, along with his assassination, are the only reasons he's remembered so well. It was, in fact, under his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, that his revenue and civil rights bills were actually passed, along with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Medicare being established. His defenders argue that he laid the groundwork for these achievements, not simply in the legislation itself, but also by inspiring the nation towards the goals. His actions in foreign affairs are undeniably significant. Some see him as an unprepared leader whose poor decisions risked the nation's security, and others see him as exactly the right and level-headed man to lead the nation through some of its most dangerous times. But in either case, there's no denying that his leadership dramatically impacted the nation and the world. He's among the best remembered of the Cold War presidents, despite the fact that he served a shorter tenure than most. In fact, his presidency was the 7th shortest in the nation's history. Whether it was because of his success in crafting a presidential image, his tragic assassination, or his leadership, positive or negative, he nonetheless remains one of the nation's most iconic presidents. If you enjoyed this video, you can browse this channel for more videos on United States presidents from George Washington to Donald Trump, discussing their careers, personal lives, and places in history.